Hey guys. All right. So on to chapter 31. We've gone quite a ways. We're getting close to the end. I'm going to kind of start moving quickly through some of these chapters, and we're going to take care of, the basic worksheets and discussions. But we're going to kind of start paring down a little bit because we do need to get prepared for the final as well. So let's get into head traumas, if you don't mind. Basically, starting out with anatomy, the skull, the cranial skull surrounding the brain. The face is made up of about 14 different bones. The basal skull is the weakest portion, back portion of the brain, back here of the skull, the weakest portion of the skull. The skull occupies about 80 to 90% of the volume of the cranium. So we have the facial bones, 14 facial bones, but we have the rest that creates that skull cap, right? Talking about the basal skull real quick. The basal skull, being the thinnest, weakest portion of the brain, is probably the most critical area, basically because it sits right next to the brainstem. And injuries in this spot cause damage to that brainstem, which is going to lead to some severe brain traumas. One of the experiences I had with this was a law officer in La Habra here. Uh, Third motorcycle accident he had. This time he was thrown from his vehicle, landed headfirst, thrown from his motorcycle, landed headfirst on the ground. When we showed up, this is a young 28-year-old male. He is extremely buff. He's a strong dude. And the injury he received, we can kind of tell pretty quickly what the area of brain that was injured, near that brainstem, the way he was reacting. He was fighting us, incoherent, not aware of his surroundings, but he was swinging and defending everybody and everything around him. We had to life flight him out, and the skull fracture itself was the basal skull. So the injuries he received were pretty severe very quickly right off the bat. So when we identify these altered mental statuses very quickly, I talk about bruising, battle signs around the eyes, battle signs behind the ears, the bruising, raccoon eyes, bruising around the eyes. I've mentioned this before. The fact of the matter is that kind of bruising tells us that there's a possibility of skull fracture. And you can actually see it form right in front of you if it's a bad enough skull fracture. This basal skull, I could actually see the bruising form around his eyes as we were treating him. So you could tell it was a pretty bad injury right after that. Talking about those bones again, the 14 different bones within the facial features here: nasal bones, sphenoid, temporal, lacrimal bones, maxilla, mandible, the maxilla, the mandible being the only true movable bone within the skull itself, with the exception of those bones that create the ears. And then the skull cap itself, frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal bones that actually create the whole 80 to 90% of the actual skull itself. The brain, cushioned by cerebral spinal fluid. This is CSF. We talk about skull fractures, allowing this fluid to actually come out of your nose during bleeding or out of your ear during bleeding. We need to assume at this point, anytime we have nose or ear bleeding with trauma to the head, that we have a skull fracture. CSF fluid leaking from the nose or ears is an indication of basal skull fractures, and 3 layers of meninges surrounding the brain. So this is a cushioning that we have, actually protecting that brain. And remember, big important thing, when we're talking infants, so we're talking young kids, we have a brain that's really small. It's about the size of your brain. Their brain is very small in relation to their skull. So they have more fluid in there. They have more space. And so movement of that brain back and forth inside, counter coop injuries causing contusions inside or concussion, is a little more severe in a child or an infant. Talk about an infant shaken baby syndrome, right? This is something that actually leads to problems with issues with those kids, very severe issues. As you get older, that brain fills that cavity a little more. You're still at risk of concussion. You're still at risk of bruising of the brain, but it's a little more less. It's a little less, excuse me, not a little more or less. That doesn't make sense. A little less because there's not as much room for it to move around in. And we have the diagram here: the cranium, dura mater, arca mater, pia mater, the brain itself, the fluid that actually surrounds all that, and where it actually moves down into the spinal cord, as we're talking about the central, down into the eventually peripheral nervous system itself. 3 anatomical components, of the brain: cerebrum, 2 hemispheres. Each hemisphere has 4 lobes, responsible for conscious and sensory function, emotion, and personality. Cerebellum coordinates muscle movement and reflexes that maintain posture and equilibrium. The brainstem, made up of the pons, midbrain, and medulla oblongata, controls automatic functions, including cardiac, respiratory, and vascular muscle function. The medulla contains the brain, connects the brain, excuse me, I'll move myself here, brain to the spinal cord. So that medulla is the portion that connects that brain to the spinal cord, giving you all that sensory nervous system down into the peripheral nervous system where we collect the information. Oops, excuse me. Sorry, guys. Um, Scalp injuries. So we're talking now head injuries and the different types we're going to come across. Scalp injury itself, soft tissue injuries, blood vessels do not constrict well, bleeding can be profuse. Bleeding beneath the scalp can make assessments of the skull difficult. So the swelling from the bleeding underneath the scalp can actually kind of cushion everything, where we can't actually palpate any crepitus or soft spots in the skull, which is something we need to kind of identify. Now, if you find a soft spot when you're doing your head to toe exam, you find a soft spot on the skull, don't push you identify it pretty quickly and it's done. That story I told you guys about the guy who fell down the stairs, um, I thought he crushed his skull. I honestly did. We got there, he's sitting at the base of the stairs, and the wife is upset. I come in to my partner, talk to the wife, I'll hold C-spine, because we knew what was going on when we walked in. So I came up behind the gentleman. I said, I'm going to hold your head, sir. I'm going to hold you, make sure your neck is okay. I put my hand on one side of his head. And as I put my hand on the other side of his head, I could feel nothing but brain on this side. Okay. I assumed he fell down the stairs, crushed the side of his skull. How could he be sitting up talking? This is driving me crazy. I couldn't understand this. What actually happened was, though, he had brain surgery for brain cancer. His wife was explaining he should have been wearing his helmet. His balance is going to be off anyways after the surgery. And sure enough, he didn't have his helmet on as he fell down the stairs. He didn't hurt his head, but that's the steps necessary in a possible C-spine, is to hold the head still, protecting C-spine, protecting the neck. And as I put my hands there, I remember putting my hand on the other side, going, "Oh my God, I can feel his brain," until she explained that the skull cap has been removed. Now I understand. Still a weird feeling, and that's something you're looking for, but it definitely was an odd thing to feel. Skull injuries, deformities, or depression requires extreme trauma. Uh, so these type of depression fractures, deformities in the skull, takes a lot of force to cause this to actually happen. That's why I'm saying, to put my hand on his head and feel nothing but soft tissue, I'm thinking this is a nasty fall this guy took. How could he be sitting up and talking? Most skull fractures are linear, straight lines. They're not going to be jagged all over the place. Skull fractures can be open or closed. A basilar skull fracture involves the floor of the cranium, as we talked about, right near that brainstem, is where it's actually going to happen at. Underlying brain damage may occur, and honestly, from what I've seen, it is pretty typical that it's going to occur. Brain injuries, swelling, and bleeding within the skull can increase the pressure within the skull, which increases brain tissue perfusion, which decreases, excuse me, brain tissue perfusion. And also, as we talked about, it also alleviates pressure. So if they are bleeding from the ear, bleeding from their nose, bleeding from a decent laceration to the scalp, we need to know that we control the bleed, but don't stop the bleed. If we stop the bleed, we increase the pressure inside the brain, which is a bad thing. If we slow the bleed, we don't allow them to bleed out. The fact is, you're not going to have many injuries to the scalp, to the face, to these areas that are going to bleed out arterially and kill someone. They're going to bleed pretty good, but they're not enough to actually kill someone. So it's okay to allow it to kind of bleed a bit, as long as we're decreasing the amount of pressure inside the brain. The brain is basically what's going on. Traumatic brain injuries can occur from penetrating traumas, blunt traumas, or secondary injuries. Brain injuries can be open or closed. We need to make sure we're keeping an eye on. We can see the open injuries. With closed ones, we're looking at eye function, the pupils, pupillary reaction. We're looking at blood pressures, narrowing pulse pressures. We are looking at orientation levels and how they're presenting. Head traumas, different types you can have. Traumas, or excuse me, they resulted from a brain injury. Blunt force trauma, that baseball in the head. You're looking at the hematoma pressing onto the brain tissue as it bleeds, pushes inside, right? Loss of consciousness is the utmost that's going to happen in this respect. So we need to take a look at this kind of thing and understand the signs and symptoms we're looking at, decreased mental status, deformities of the skull, damage to the spine fluid, discoloration around the eyes, which is talked about the raccoon eyes, unequal pupils or pupils that do not respond to light, respiratory changes, systolic pressures may increase, heart rates may decrease, abnormal posturing, and I'll discuss posturing as we get along in here. That's an important thing for us to know about sensory motor deficits. And so these are some of the signs and symptoms we're going to identify that we have some sort of brain damage going on that we need to be aware of. And we're looking at basically a closed head injury. This, while it looks to be open, it is bleeding externally. We've got damage underneath the skull cap. That's what's happening, bleeding underneath. We have tissue damage that's bleeding outward, but we have no fracture through the skull into the brain itself, correct? Open head injury. So there's a laceration to the scalp, and you see this is right across the just above the forehead, and so we've obviously got possible skull fracture on top of this, which is making it an open head injury. Now we understand that even though we have a skull fracture, it does not mean the end of life. This may be severe enough to break the skull cap, but as long as brain matter is still intact, we have somebody who is viable. Remember, a sign of no life, something that we can't do anything about, is when brain matter is exposed. Brain matter is no longer in the skull, basically. When that happens, and that person is full arrest, we do have the ability to say, we're done. There's nothing more we can do at this point. And so we'll discuss more about that as we get along. I went ahead and posted your mural project yesterday, because you're watching this on Tuesday. I posted it yesterday. Hopefully, you guys are working on that. We'll be talking about that specifically as we get ready for our skills testing. I will pose a document to you guys here soon with the case study for chapter 31 that I'd love for you guys to go ahead and work through. And other than that, guys, I'm done with this lecture, and I will be posting lecture number 2 very soon. Okay, thank you very much. Good to talk to you, and looking forward to seeing how you guys do in your new careers.